And so onto the clutch, the dear old triple clutch. I say that because it's pretty unique as far as motorcycle clutches go, or certainly as far as British motorcycle clutches go. Most British motorcycle clutches are multi-plate wet clutches. This is single plate dry. So this doesn't run in oil, it runs in its own separate little housing, and it's a single plate. So it's a single plate, and the actual clutch plate is very similar, certainly the same size as that of an old Mini. So think of it, it's more like a car clutch with this dry single plate rather than a normal motorcycle clutch. The problem is that for various reasons about machining and tolerances and so on, it can not work well. It can drag a lot, not release. You know, it'd be hard to find neutral, and it can also be very heavy to operate and drag. It doesn't tend to slip. It can slip, but it can be problematic. So the first thing I've done is I put a couple of lock nuts on here and some spacers on the shaft because that's not threaded. And then using the lock nut and this nut, and I've been opening the clutch, because what this is a pull rod, and the clutch actually opens by the rod pulling the clutch open. There's like a big spring, and this pulls the spring and releases it. So again, most motorcycle clutches are push rods. They push the spring open, this pulls it open, and also this only has one giant spring in it, a bit like a Commando, rather than lots of individual springs on most Triumphs. So anyway, a couple of things I've been doing. So I've been doing that because I've been checking how even the lift is. So I've been opening the clutch, releasing it until the clutch plate is free, and then been using feeler gauges all the way round, and no surprise that it lifts much higher on one side than the other. So at the moment I've got it lifted at 6 thou. It's lifting to 6 thou on one side, but over 15 on the other. Now that means that when that side is still down, still not released, when this side is about 5, 6, 7, 8 thou open, that's what's causing the dragging. You know, you're putting the clutch in and this side is releasing, but this side isn't. So not great. And what we've got to try and do is minimize that unevenness of lift to get the best we can. But of course there's no real adjustment to allow us to do that, but we'll do our best. So I've checked that, so I know that it's uneven. The second thing I've done is I've checked to see if there's any markings, any punch markings on the casing, because sometimes they should really, there's two big heavy casings, but we'll see them when we get it apart. But they're balanced, they can be balanced. And so I've been checking for punch marks. I can't see any. When we get it apart, I'll check for more punch marks, but normally if there are any punch marks, they'll be on the outer edges here to say these two parts are balanced and they go together, but I can't see any, so I can't see that it's balanced at all. So I know that it's lifting unequally. I can see that there's quite a bit of grease in there, so almost certainly contaminated with grease. What we're going to do now is I'm going to take these nuts off, then we're going to actually undo the clutch, take it apart and see what's what, and work on it from there and try to get it as good as we possibly can. Right, So we've got the cover plate. This is the spring, this is the big bevel spring that operates on the clutch. This is the pressure plate. I said I checked for marks, didn't I? Can't see any marks. And this is the clutch plate. Yeah, that's a pretty knackered clutch plate. It's almost down to the rivets, you can see there. Not much wear on it at all. Bit of contamination from grease, definitely. And yeah, that's an ex clutch plate. There's not much meat left on that. Almost down to the rivets, and a bit of contamination. So what we're going to do, I'm going to take this down to the engineers the first thing and get these completely flat. Get these two sides completely flat. That's the first thing, and also these fingers. I'll also get these cut down if we can. They can take these screw out, I think. Yeah, they're screwed in. We'll take these sort of locating dowels out, as I remember they're screwed in, and then when they're flattening the plate, we'll get them to flatten these as well in the same relation to the plate, because what we want to try and do is to get the pressure plate so it's nice and even, but the cover plate can be distorted in itself. But we'll get this flattened and that flattened and the fingers cut down. That's the first thing we'll do, and then we'll take it from there. We'll get a new clutch plate. We'll get a new bearing. We'll get a new bearing for the back of here, which this bearing takes all the power of the clutch to open. So when you're riding along and you go to open the clutch, it pulls sideways on this bearing, and this bearing isn't really designed to take it. So there's a special bevel bearing that you can get that's designed to take much more sideways pressure, force, and we'll put a proper angle bearing in there. So because otherwise the bearing they can wear very quickly. To begin with, let me say that I am still working on trying to get a perfect clutch. So every time I do it, I learn a bit more, and I'm certainly by no means anywhere near getting it absolutely spot on, but I'm going to take you through the various things and ideas and problems and how I'm addressing things at the moment. So first of all, we've had the main basket has been skimmed, and also the fingers on top have been skimmed to get them completely parallel and flat with each other, and so that's a flat surface. We've also had the pressure plate has also been skimmed as well, and the clutch plate, I'll go through that in a minute, the clutch plate sits there between the two flat surfaces. We've also had 2 holes drilled in the back of the pressure plate. That is because we're going to fit this special bearing. As I was saying before, when the clutch is opened, there's a pull rod, a rod that goes in there and pulls the clutch open, and there's a massive sideways force on the bearing. So this is a special sort of angled bearing to try and take that force. If you look at the inner ring of this bearing, you'll see it's thin. If you look at the inner ring on this side, sorry, it's thick. If you look at the inner ring on this side, it's thin. That's because the actual bearings inside are angled. They're not like a normal circular bearing. They're actually angular to try and take the sideways force. And so we're going to be fitting that in here shortly. The thing is about these angled bearings is they actually come apart. Now, what would happen is if I fitted this angled bearing and then for some reason in future I wanted to remove it, because it's hidden in there, so like underneath there, you can only see the inner race. then the only way of driving the bearing out is by hitting the inner race. But because this is an angle bearing, all that happens is the bearing will actually come apart. This inner race will just come away. I might show you that later on if I can. And that means you can't get the rest of the bearing stuck in there. So it was actually Costa Zafiri who told me about this this sort of modification, so thanks to him. You drill those two holes so that if at any time in the future you need to remove this bearing, then you can put a small punch through, small drift through those holes onto the outer race and drift the whole bearing out. So that's a little modification. If you're going to use one of these uprating bearings, and I strongly recommend you do, is to drill those two little holes in the pressure plate to make sure you can get it out in future if you ever need to. And I'll say this again many times, but the thick outer race, the face of the pull rod goes on that. So basically when we fit it, the small inner race goes upwards inside the bearing. Then we've got the diaphragm spring. It's a single spring clutch, and that goes on the pressure plate, and then there's the outer plate that then goes over the top, and the spring goes between this outer plate and the pressure plate. Okay, so that's the sort of basic operation, but so we've got the problem that it doesn't disengage too well and it's heavy. So that's why we've had this skimmed, to try and make sure everything's flat, because the general reason why the clutch doesn't disengage very well is because it disengages unevenly. So whilst it might open one side of the plate nice and wide, but the other side is still closed. So we've got to try and get it to open as evenly as possible to stop it dragging. And then it's heavy. Now, how to adjust a heavy clutch when you've only got a single spring? The nearest sort of clutch we've got to a Trident is a Norton Commando, and what that is, because that's a multi-plate wet clutch, but that has also got a single spring, not like the multi-springs of normal sort of Triumph twins. So a Commando has a sort of mixture of the two. It has multi-plate wet but with a single spring. Now, if you want to make the Commando clutch lighter, what you actually do is add more springs, more plates, which you would think would therefore put more and more pressure on the spring and therefore make the clutch heavier. But it doesn't. What it actually does is you add more plates and it actually flattens the spring because there's more plates, and that by flattening the spring there's actually less power in the spring. When it's sort of clenched, it's got a lot of power, but when it's actually flat, it can't exert that much pressure. So it's a sort of counterintuitive way of doing things, and that's basically what we're going to try and do to some extent with the Trident clutch. But of course we can't add more clutch plates because there's only one clutch plate in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to fit, this is a new special extra thick clutch plate, which will has a sort of same effect as adding more clutch plates. We're just adding one clutch plate but thicker. So this clutch plate is about 295 wide. A standard clutch plate is about 265 wide, so it's about 30 thou wider than a standard clutch plate. This is the old clutch plate that we took out, which is actually 255, because obviously it's worn by about 10 thou or so. So this is actually going to be 40 thou thicker than the plate that we took out. And so the idea is that will then push this up higher, push on the spring, flatten the spring, and therefore reduce its power, its ability to push, even though it is counterintuitive, because obviously you're pushing the spring and actually winding the spring up. But it definitely works on a Commando, that when the spring is flat it's definitely lighter than when it's sort of arched. So we'll definitely be doing that. And we'll see how we go with this. Then we've also got to make sure that that everything's flat and so on, because the other problem is, as I say, even with that added and even with all this ground down and flattened, we still might have the problem that one side releases before the other. So it could be that we actually grind the spring down, because that's about the only variable that we've got. This is flat, that's flat, we've got a new clutch plate, but when we put it all together, if we find out that it's still releasing on one side and not the other, then we can adjust the spring. We'll actually grind the spring down. There's another problem with it. Well, one reason why the clutch drags is there's not much lift available on the actual clutch mechanism. It doesn't give a great deal of lift. So even on maximum lift, you only get about, I don't know, I can't remember, 25 thou lift or something. So you haven't got much. So that's why you need to get everything absolutely perfect, because you've only got so much lift that the actual mechanism will give. So the whole thing's a bit of a pain, to be honest, but if we get it right, it should be, they work fine on my bikes. To be honest, on one bike the clutch is really, really light. On the other bike it's fairly light, but not as light as the other one, but they're both exactly the same clutches that I've done exactly the same on. But that's the way it goes. Right, so what I'm going to do is I'm now going to assemble the whole thing. Well, I'm going to put this we're going to put this bearing in the pressure plate first, and then we'll assemble the whole thing with a spring, screw it down, release, and then putting the push rod in and pull rod in rather, and screwing some nuts down, we'll actually release the bearing like we did before. We'll release the clutch rather and check and see how even the release is, and how far we have to keep lifting that pull rod before the whole clutch is released, because it will still drag. Even if this side is like released by sort of 25 thou, if that side's still dragging, still in contact, then the whole clutch is going to drag no matter what. So we've got to get it as free as possible. Right, so first thing we'll do is put this bearing in to the pressure plate. There we go. So, bearings in, and then we'll start to assemble the clutch, at least for the first time, and see what we've got. So we're going to assemble the clutch for the first time. It's probably the first time of many assemblies, because we're going to be moving things around to try and get the best operating sort of mode we can. So what I've done is I've marked all the component parts with Tipp-Ex, and what I'm going to do is on the first assembly, apart from the clutch plate, on the first assembly I'm going to line all these white dots up, or these Tipp-Ex dots up, so that's going to be my starting point. So it might be that I move things around to try and get the best action I can, but I know that's my starting point. Clutch plate goes in flange down into the basket, then pressure plate, as I say, I'm going to line up those dots to begin with, because of course the pressure plate can go in 3 different places. There are 3 lugs, so I'm going to start off with the pressure plate in that position. If it'll actually go down, which it won't at the moment. There we go, finally gone down. Okay, then the spring, and again I'll line the spring up in the same place, and then the outer cover plate, which I'm just looking at it because they can warp, and then you can't really machine them. That's the trouble. There are 3 dowels, and so they locate with the 3 holes in the cover plate. Yeah, that's better. Okay, so then I'm going to take the screws and I'm just going to screw it down and see what we've got. I'm not going to put the lock tabs in because this will be the first sort of test assembly. As I say, this could go on for hours. Lots of turning the pressure plate round, turning this plate round, turning the spring round, grinding the spring down, just trying to get the best action we can. So I'm just going to put these in for now. I'm not going to cover them, screwing all these up, but we'll come back when these are all screwed down. Okay, I've screwed these 12 little bolts down using the electric zapper. It's great for this because I'm going to be screwing these down and unscrewing them time after time, and so a little electric zapper is fantastic. I'm now going, this is the pull rod, and this goes into that bearing that I was saying about, and to release the clutch, this is called a pull rod because the clutch, this rod pulls up and it actually pulls the clutch apart. And so that, you can see, that's why that bearing is so important, because to open the clutch it takes some huge amount of force, and all the sideways force goes on that bearing. And if you have a normal bearing like this one, then it can just, it can wreck it because it's not really designed to take that sideways force. This bearing is designed to take that lateral force. Okay, clutch pull rod's in, and I'm going to screw it up and down to release the clutch, but there's a unthreaded part there. So let's see, sort of my washer on, is it? Trying to remember the order I'm doing things now. The spacer, yeah, 2 spacers, so that takes us to the threaded part of the pull rod. Then I can put the actual nuts on to lift it and pull it, and so it will open the clutch. And so what I'm doing is I'm just going to do that. Now that's pretty good. I only turned it a couple of times and already the clutch plate is loose, so that's fantastic news. That's much better than I would have dared hope for, really. Super. So I'll just take that back down and see how much that was again. Right, I should really put like a dial gauge on here and I could see the lift, but that's no, never mind. That's just about biting. So I'm going to do it in 1 flat, 2 flats, 3 flats, and it's just releasing after 3 flats. That's pretty good. I'm very, very happy with that. And then I'll turn it 1 more flat. And there we have full release. And wow, so that's fantastic. I'm so happy with that. It's not dragging. Wow, that's brilliant. So I'm going to get some, I'm going to get some feeler gauges in there. I'm just going to have a look at it and see if the gaps, the release gap is even all round, and it would seem to be, so that's amazing. But it's still 10. Yeah, 10. Wow, that's amazing. So it would seem to be, I can't quite believe my lucky stars, but let's have a look. That one, yeah, all that's going in. So I would say that the lift is between 1 and, the difference in the lift all the way around is between 1 and 2 thou, which is just incredible. So it's like job done. I can't believe it, but I'm not going to touch it. Crikey, the merest sort of turn on the lift and it frees all the way around. That's just brilliant. That is just brilliant. I can't tell you how good that is. I've done a few of these, and wow. Oh no, I've got to centre the clutch now. Centre the clutch plate, because like on a car, when you've got a single clutch plate, you've got to get this plate so it's dead in the middle. As you can probably see, it's not dead in the middle now. So there's a clutch centering tool, and I will, and I've got that, and I will use that to centre the clutch in a minute. Wow. It's pretty amazing. Pretty amazing. Right, going to do final assembly now. For a start, I've got this clutch plate rather, centering tool, which is a very simple little thing. Goes in the clutch hub. I've got a clutch plate, and then that spigot will line up with the pressure plate, and then we know the clutch is central, the plate is central, so that when we come to put it actually in the bike, it's all going to line up. If the plate wasn't central when we come to put it in the bike, then the clutch will be slightly out of line and it won't actually go in, because the housing that the clutch sits in, there's almost no gap around the edge, and so the clutch needs to be absolutely central. If it's off, it just simply won't go in. And I forgot to mention that this very simple, very clever clutch plate centering tool, which is worth its weight in gold, that was lent to me by Richard Davies again, along with some of the other special tools, because these aren't actually made. No, they are made, but there's some ridiculous prices as far as I remember. So he actually 3D printed this, which is fantastic. You know, there is advantages to modern technology. So you can buy them, but they're really expensive. The other alternative, I meant to say, if you haven't got a clutch hub centering tool, what I've done in the past, it's not ideal, I have to say, is I've left these nuts loose to slack so that the clutch plate can still move, then put the whole assembly on, got it there, and then tightened those nuts up. Right, then I'm going to put the merest, and I mean the merest bit of grease on these tabs. Because you don't want grease on this getting on that clutch plate, but you know, at the same time you want it to run as smoothly as you can. Just the merest touch. Then I'm going to line up with my original marks because they seem to be perfect, so I'm not going to mess about with them. And then move the clutch, and so that centering tool goes through the hole in the bearing there. So I don't know if you can see that, but that means the clutch plate is now absolutely central. Just double check I've got my marks right. Again, I'm going to put the merest whiff of grease on this where the spring goes, but I mean just the merest touch. Line up my marks again. Yeah. Okay, and then the merest touch of grease around the cover plate where the spring goes again. Okay, and again use my marks, line it up. On it goes. Marvellous. We can picture there, yeah, I think we have. Right, then I've got the new locking tabs, obviously, and so then these go in. Okay, there we have it. Get the clutch centering tool out, so we know that's all in line now. And what I'm going to do is, just for peace of mind, I'm going to put the pull rod back in and do that opening test just for the final time, just to check everything's okay. Right, brilliant. I've just put the pull rod back in and very gently tested it so I didn't move the clutch plate, and again spot on, so phew, fantastic. So all I need to do now is to bend these lock tabs up, and the clutch is finished and ready to go into the clutch housing on the bike. So all that remains to be done is to actually fit the clutch onto the clutch hub inside the clutch housing. So the first and vital thing to do is to put the pull rod in. Okay, because if you forget to do that, as has been done by various people in the past, and you put everything together, put all the chain case on and everything, and then you suddenly realise at the very end that you've forgotten to put this in, and you've got to take the whole thing apart. Right, so if we have centred this clutch plate properly, it should just slide onto the splines of the clutch hub. There we go, just like that. Marvellous. And of course the first time you actually pull the clutch in, you can just hear it, you can see there's very little clearance, but don't worry, the first time you actually pull the clutch in, it will centre itself fully, and obviously it's just hanging there on the clutch hub at the moment. But there you go, that's it, in, clutch, sorted, which is, I mean, I can't get over it, you know, because, well, I'm hoping that in operation it's as good as it was on the bench, because that was like a miracle clutch. And hopefully having that thick plate will mean that the actual operation will be light, and it will also work properly, and it won't drag because it's opening so evenly and so quickly. You know, sometimes you have to, you know, do that nut up and do that nut up and do that nut up more and more and more before the clutch will disengage, but that disengaged almost straight away. So, well, on paper it looks good, obviously. Not until we get the engine going and actually use the clutch will we know. But anyway, clutch in. Next thing to do is to fit the oil pump, and then it will be the inner primary chain case cover.